Dear Dr. Sabit, thank you again for joining me. I thought it would have been great to have asked more questions about a particular theme in the sessions we had before. So, in order to make up for that, I proposed another session today, specifically on the notion of a Baha'i university. So, there are all sorts of questions that can be raised about that, but I'm I'm just hoping that with your experience in higher education in the United States and in other places, and with your experience in working with Baha'i universities or institutions of higher education, with that background, I hoped you could throw some of the ideas you could share with us some of the ideas you've had to formulate in order to be directly involved with projects of this kind. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really an excellent topic. I'm very interested in this. And and definitely I have to say in the beginning that whatever I say would be my own personal interpretations. And I deeply believe in that because most Baha'i concepts, including concept of university, is something that is should be looked at as a process oriented rather than just as a some formulation with rigid approach. And so I also thought about the title. I thought instead of, let's say, Baha'i University, I thought maybe if we call it something like Reflection on a Baha'i-inspired approach to university. So that could be more appropriate for my presentation. Now, what is really the concept of Baha'i University? I would like to immediately relate that to a very broad concept, but it could be really enlightening. And that is the concept of Baha'i University is deeply intertwined with the concept of with a perspective of a civilizational change in the world. So when we speak about a Baha'i University, we should not picture a fixed, perfectly designed institution that will suddenly appear in the future, like a mechanical building that could be installed, or as if it was a finished, completed project ready to be built. That is the most important thing we should remember when we discuss this topic. Nor should we imagine it as something isolated from the long history of human learning and education. In other words, when we say Baha'i University, it's not a uniquely institution or ideas. It is instead, it is more helpful to see the Baha'i universities as a living and evolving idea, one that grows naturally, organically out of humanity's ongoing search for knowledge, for meaning, for purpose and values. So it is rooted in that sense, it is rooted in centuries of intellectual effort, philosophical works, spiritual aspirations, moral struggle, and across many civilizations and cultures. So we are inheriting that as we are trying to establish or explore the concept of Baha'i University. And we have to respect that. We have to acknowledge that. We have to use that background. So in this sense, a Baha'i University is not an artificial invention or a break from history. It is deeply connected to the totality or accumulated wisdom of humanity. And by that, I mean, as I mentioned, scientific discoveries, philosophical insight, artistic achievement, religious teachings and traditions. So Baha'i vision of higher education does not dismiss or reject these traditions. On the contrary, it values them as essential part of our collective legacy, inheritance. What it seeks to do is to bring these diverse streams of thoughts into a more coherent, integrated, and ethically grounded understanding of knowledge. That's what we want to do. We want to bring all of those into a coherent, integrated picture. So from this perspective, a Baha'i university takes seriously the major points or era in human intellectual or paradigms, in ancient and modern intellectual history. And I specifically want to mention the scientific revolution of the past 500 years, primarily in Europe. For instance, when Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolves around the sun, or when Kepler formulated his laws of planetary motion, turned his telescope towards the heavens. So these are really major developments that could be the foundation of any university, including Baha'i University. So because they did not just change astronomy, for instance, but rather they transformed how humanity understands or must understand reality itself. These discoveries, these inventions, they introduce a new way of knowing based on careful observation, experimentation, and reasoning, logical reasoning. So these developments laid the foundation for modern science and therefore dramatically reshaped how people relate to nature, to knowledge, and to truth-seeking. So this scientific transformation was later, of course, reinforced by movement such as rationalism, emphasis on rationalism, empiricism, and the period of enlightenment. And that was with the rise of industrialization and modern technology, which was the outcome of those developments. So together, these shifts encourage people to question the inherited reality and think critically and seek progress through finding evidence and measurable facts. And these were not simply technical advances, but rather they represented the profound cultural and intellectual reorientation, a new way of seeing the world and humanity's places within it. So up to the point that you can clearly see how Baha'i University is linked to these traditions of knowledge, or to be a little more technical, to the history of epistemology of the past and modern times. At the same time, now we are somehow adding something more. Even though these developments were powerful and necessary, they also brought unintended consequences. And one of them was one of these, consequences of modern development often broke down knowledge into pieces or separate disciplines, making it harder to see connection between sciences, to see the unity of knowledge and ethics and spirituality. Here again enters a glimpse of Bahá'í approach. These developments or unintended consequences tended to a reductionist approach, I would say, which resulted in considering moral and spiritual questions as secondary or irrelevant to serious intellectual work. And in many cases, it reduces human purpose, human life, to economic productivity or technological efficiency. In other words, humanity gained tremendous power, no doubt about that, and understanding and knowledge, but sometimes lost a sense of deeper meaning and values and broader spiritual and moral direction. So it is precisely here that the Bahá'í conception of the university becomes especially relevant. Rather than rejecting modern science or feeling nostalgic or romanticizing the past, the Bahá'í University seeks to build on a strength of modern thought while addressing its limitations. This is a summary of what we can say. It envisions an educational model in which scientific precision and ethical responsibility and spiritual insight are not treated as separate or competing or as competing domains, but a mutually reinforcing dimensions of a single coherent framework of knowledge. So in this vision, higher education, university education, is not limited to preparing students for jobs or teaching them technical skills. These are worthy causes, but not limited to these. It is about forming the whole person. That's the way I see the purpose of a Bahá'í university. Whole person or whole human beings who are intellectually capable, advanced, and morally grounded, socially accountable and responsible, and spiritually aware or conscious or conscientiously aware. So a Bahá'í university aims to help individuals not only succeed in material success and economic progress, which are important, an integral part of the university education, but also contribute consciously to the creation of a more unified and global comprehensive civilization. Ultimately, then, a Bahá'í university is more than just another institution of higher learning like many others that now exist in the world. It's a part of a broader, as I mentioned in the beginning, civilizational project. An effort to align humanity's growing scientific and technological powers with its equally urgent need for meaning, purpose, and ethical guidance. It represents an attempt to unite knowledge with values, progress, and with responsibility, and use intellectual excellence with service to humanity. Now, this is just a general background that I wanted like some sort of introduction to what we are going to discuss. Now I go to discussion a bit of structural issues here. I think this is very important. And by that I mean, we have to distinguish between Baha'i institution, in other words, institutions of higher learning or universities and colleges that are built by Baha'is or Baha'i individuals, and a Baha'i vision of higher education that is for humanity. It is not just a Baha'i thing. So it is helpful to begin this by clearly distinguishing between these two different realities, related but different realities. So the first is a university or college that as I mentioned, is actually established, let's say, by Baha'i individuals, funded by Baha'i individuals, or Baha'i communities in certain specific places in the world, and for particular purpose. But the second one is, as I mentioned, is the Baha'i vision of what higher education should be in general concept, in general terms, for humanity as a whole. So these two perspectives or approaches are closely connected, and there are shared principles and values, yet they operate in different levels and should not be treated as identical, at least in the way that I understand it. Now let's discuss it a bit more. You see, a Baha'i funded college or funded and founded college or university is always shaped by concrete circumstances and practical needs. Let's say, for example, Baha'is might establish an institution in a rural region where communities depend heavily on, let's say, agriculture. In that case, the central purpose of the school could be to, train, educate students, university students, for instance, in sustainable farming, or in water management, or community development, so that local families and community can improve their livelihood and food security, for instance. The curriculum, research activities are all they do, and the community outreach of those institutions would naturally reflect these specific social and economic realities. In other contexts, Baha'is might create a college focused on preparing teachers for primary and secondary schools, especially in areas where quality education is scarce. These are just scenarios. Such an institution might emphasize pedagogy, child development, moral education, and community service, and providing skills to strengthen local schools and future generation of teachers. Again, in this case, the purpose of the institution is clearly tied to a particular need in a particular community and environment, social environment. These kinds of institutions are important, very valuable, but they represent one level of discussion here. They are actual, practical Baha'i founded colleges created for specific practical purposes. At the same time, when we speak of a Baha'i university in a broader sense, we are referring to something more than any single institution or local project. We are talking about a Baha'i vision of higher education itself, a way of thinking about what universities should be now and in the future, and regardless of who establishes them. And because in this context, if we are talking about universities of a civilization that belongs to all, in this second approach to Baha'i University, we are talking about building a universal global civilization with all its broad dimensions and categories and all that, and that belongs to all, not just Baha'is, not just Christians or Muslims or Chinese or American. So this vision concerns how knowledge should be organized, and we are going to briefly discuss how science and spirituality should relate, how students should be educated morally and intellectually, and how education should serve the advancement of civilization as a whole. And I add something here very, very briefly. Maybe in previous discussions we discussed that. Perhaps the only unique presupposition that Baha'i bring into this general picture is that that the nature of reality is not materialistic. And so that needs to be further discussed. And I try to briefly discuss it. And I think that inclusion of exploration of the concept of materialism, both as a way of life and as a philosophical tradition, is an integral part of Baha'i approach to knowledge, to epistemology, to ethics, and so on, which I believe is becoming more and more acceptable, even by purely secular institutions of higher learning. So when we're discussing a Baha'i university, it's essential to keep this distinction in mind. That's between the Baha'i founded and this general vision. One conversation focuses on real institutions founded by Baha'is to meet specific needs. And the other conversation is about a broader Baha'i-inspired understanding of higher education for now and the future of humanity, which goes beyond any single institution or community. And both of these approaches are important, but they answer different questions and should not be somehow confused with one another, particularly in terms of structure, planning, and so on. So the other thing that I would like to mention is how it must be mentioned. In other words, we have to mention that for the institutions created by Baha'is, their founders, it's again about those institutions that are created by Baha'is. We have to expect that they may choose to use consciously specific Baha'i teachings and moral principles and moral codes in shaping both what is taught and how education should take place, because it is a project founded by Baha'is with a specific purpose. This might, and we have to expect that, this might include emphasizing, for instance, consultation as a way of making collective decisions, or basically saying that our goal is prepare students for service to society, to humanity, as a core educational aim. And also development of a student's moral and spiritual capacity. They may mention that along with farming and agriculture And teacher preparation, we want the foundation is we want to establish a foundation of spiritual and moral capacities. And furthermore, since these institutions are funded or founded in by Baha'is, so those founders may seek to reshape its culture and day-to-day life according to Baha'i ethical principles. This could influence how students, faculty, and administration relate to one another, how disagreements are resolved, how issues of fairness, integrity, grading, assessment are handled, and how integrity, respect, and cooperation are understood in the institution, and so on. So in this sense, the university becomes not just as a place for acquiring knowledge, but a community that embodies a distinct moral and behavioral perspective driven from Baha'i teachings. So my point is, this is important, and we have to acknowledge and establish it. Acknowledge it, basically. Now, as I mentioned, alongside this institutional scenario, there is a second and equally important question, which I initially discussed, and I think it's the focus of our discussion today. And that is, what is the Baha'i vision of higher education in general, beyond any particular institutional focus? And this is a deeper issue, of course. It is not only about how Baha'i founded school should operate, but about how higher education as a whole should evolve in response to humanity's changing needs, moral challenges, and generally how university education becomes a civilizational building enterprise. Even though these two perspectives or these two approaches are different, the concrete reality of Baha'i founded institution and the broader Baha'i vision of higher education, they share some essential features. Most importantly, both rest on the conviction that education must be based on an integrated, comprehensive approach to knowledge, that one brings together a spiritual insight and scientific reason, and carefully responds to changing conditions of humanity. In practical terms, this means that education cannot be reduced simply to technical training without moral meaning, and it cannot only focus on spiritual development while neglecting rational inquiry and scientific understanding. These two must go hand in hand, whether in a Baha'i institution founded with a specific focus on Baha'i teachings, or a vision of Baha'i faith for the university system in general, that this unity of subjective and objective, scientific and moral, spiritual, are essential. And the belief that scientific, philosophical, and spiritual ways of knowing should inform and strengthen one another, rather than exist in isolation. So from this point on, even a school that focuses mainly, that is a critical point that I want to mention here. Even those schools that focus mainly on Baha'i studies, let's say, could not limit itself only to Baha'i theology or scripture in a narrow way. It would need to stay open to discourses, to conversations with science, philosophy, history, and the wider intellectual traditions of humanity. And I think the reason for that is the very nature of Baha'i perspective, that it aims to establish a universal civilization based on two pillars of science and religion. So it is a natural outgrowth of that. So this kind of openness does not dilute, as some people may think, that Baha'i scholarship. Rather, it makes it richer, and placing Baha'i thought within humanity's long and shared search for truth across different cultures and times. So my understanding is that even in institutions of higher learning that is focused on Baha'i studies cannot ignore these currents of philosophy, science, discoveries, social movement, and so on. There must be a close collaboration and interactions. In other words, this kind of openness, as I said, requires a richer approach that put Baha'i thought, Baha'i understanding, along with shared search for truth across different cultures and times. At the same time, this is also another side of this discussion, a Baha'i vision of higher education could certainly include learning institutions that main purpose is to deepen people's or Baha'is understanding of their faith. That is, its history, teachings, ethics, and social principles. But these would not function like traditional religious seminaries of the past that, to some of them at least, separated themselves from the broader world of knowledge and human experience and focused only on training clergy, for a simple reason that there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith. Instead, from a Baha'i perspective, deep knowledge of the faith is naturally, that is my point, naturally and closely connected to a broader understanding of humanity, its past, its present, its challenges, and in future possibilities. To really understand, to truly understand Baha'i teachings, one also needs to engage with science, culture, history, and philosophy. In this sense, studying the Baha'i faith is not about, let's say, withdrawing from the world of ideas and focusing on Baha'i books and texts, but about engaging these books, these texts, these scriptures more fully and thoughtfully with the currents of the world, intellectual, scientific currents of the world. Similarly, universities focus mainly on science, I'm going to other side, or technology or professional fields, cannot afford to ignore ethical, spiritual, and philosophical questions. And this is becoming more and more apparent all over the world. When, let's say, technical education becomes detached, technical and professional, let me add that too, from moral purpose, issues such as human dignity, responsibility, accountability, and the ultimate aim of progress are somehow pushed away, pushed aside. So a Baha'i-inspired approach insists that technical and professional excellence, and I here also put a stronger emphasis on applied sciences, areas that use the mother of sciences in physics and chemistry and biology and apply it to betterment of human condition, such as medicine, for instance, must go hand in hand with ethical clarity and a commitment to serving humanity. Briefly, what truly distinguishes a Baha'i approach to higher education, whether in specific institutions or in a broader vision, is not withdrawing from the world's intellectual life, but a commitment to integration, bringing together faith and reason, bringing together moral purpose and technical competence, and linking local needs with global responsibility, and creating a coherent and forward-looking framework for higher education. So in that sense, if we want to define the purpose and philosophy of higher education from a Baha'i perspective, is that the first question we have to ask is not simply what jobs a university should produce, but what kind of human beings it should help to educate or develop or cultivate. Of course, I have to mention this: employment and economic well-being, important, matter. They are very important. But they cannot be the ultimate purpose of education, higher education. A Baha'i-inspired approach would see the university as a place where people learn how to think clearly, act according to ethical conscience, serve others, and understand their roles in a changing world. So being educated would mean having intellectual capacity and moral responsibility together, so that knowledge becomes a tool for the betterment of society rather than just personal advancement. A Baha'i vision would challenge the very modern, or the way universities divide knowledge into isolated boxes. This is just enhancing what I've been trying to say. Isolated boxes that rarely speak to one another. So instead of separating science from ethics or faith from reason, higher education would be organized around ideas that all authentic knowledge is interconnected. I mean, if they fail to do so, they basically ignore this fundamental aspect of knowledge, which is at the essence of traditional epistemological, philosophical notion throughout centuries, that the unity of knowledge should be first acknowledged and then transferred from generation to generation. And as it advances, I'm not saying that it's just a set of mechanical formula that will be transferred from one generation to the next, but through it evolves, but the foundation remains the same. The students should learn, scientific inquiry, philosophical reflection, even artistic creativity, spiritual insight, and consider all of these as different lenses for understanding the same reality, from artistic to logical to rational to moral to spiritual. In this sense, then, the concept of truth, which is really at the heart of being a human, would not be seen as belonging to one discipline, even though for specialization is necessary sometimes. But it doesn't mean belonging to one discipline or culture alone, but as a something community or human race approaches collectively through many forms of knowing. Another area that I wanted to briefly mention is the education and technology, the relationship between these two, and particularly in with the emergence of artificial intelligence is becoming much more significant these days. So from a Baha'i perspective, technology, including artificial intelligence, are not accidental developments. They are natural outgrowth of scientific progress. And together, these developments are driving the material evolution of civilization forward. When we talk about civilization, we are not talking about something absolutely idealistic, subjective, something in the air. We are talking about a venue, a material, this worldly foundation for the establishment of a spiritually minded, ethically grounded civilization. But these ideas, these great ideas, need a this worldly venue, socio-political structure in order to be implemented. And so therefore, technology has provided that for us. This material evolution of civilization. So this represents one of humanity's greatest achievement, in fact. It also brings new risks and responsibilities, obviously, like any other technology in the past. As material power expands, the need for strong spiritual and moral framework becomes even more urgent. Because technology alone cannot let us work the power wisely or how to get the most benefit from it. So for this reason, universities would need to focus not only on teaching students basically how to use technology, but on educating human beings who can think wisely in response to humanity's rapidly changing technological and material conditions. So we really need a new definition of human nature and potential and capacities, and bring up the concept of human soul and human spirit, and the way the triumphant march of human soul, human spirit throughout history. Really understand that, and then use that in order to deal with these rapid scientific and technological development that are taking place in the world. So in that sense, we need to cultivate critical reasoning. We need to develop intellectual discernment, a stronger, firmer moral judgment, and making students able to distinguish between truth from misinformation, and also being active, dynamic in their social environment, not passively shaped by digital systems. It also means encouraging the use of technology in ways that protect human dignity. Should never forget that. Strengthen community and promote social well-being rather than allowing quick answers or so-called automated tools to replace our understanding, reflection, genuine learning, and that unique human soul, human consciousness, and human spirit that stands beyond that. Continuing with that, we have to say that a Baha'i-inspired university should be, should develop or should see moral and civic education as central, not optional. Students should be encouraged to think seriously about topics such as justice, responsibility, service to society, harmony between individual freedom and social responsibility, that they go hand in hand. We cannot separate them. We cannot just focus on individual and or the society. They need to work together. They have mutual respect, mutual relationship, individual and the society. So the goal would be to prepare people who can be engaged very respectfully across differences. That's another part of this civic education that must be taught, in fact, incorporated into the entire curriculum. I'm not suggesting that universities come and teach one course on civic responsibility. That's not enough. These things should be revolved around the entire curriculum, and how to develop that civic responsibility, how to resist polarization, and contribute constructively to the discourse of the society. So in that sense, education would be a much more about character as it is about, gaining university credentials or degrees. Along with that, we have to focus on relationship between education and society. Rather than viewing universities as servants of the state or the market alone, I think a Baha'i approach would see them as institutions that exist for the advancement of humanity as a whole. They would engage with social problems not by becoming partisan, that is so critical these days, but by fostering thoughtful, principled, and collaborative response. And in this way, universities would help shape society rather than merely reacting to it. Then, of course, this concept, these are the things that we discussed, create a global vision and some sort of knowledge pluralism, that a Baha'i vision would encourage universities to move beyond narrow or single culture frameworks of knowledge and to think in really authentic civilizational terms. Instead of assuming that one tradition, one worldview, or one culture or cultural perspective holds the full picture of truth or education. So we have to invite the students to see humanities learning as a shared and evolving inheritance. And that means understanding what knowledge has been shaped by many people's histories and intellectual traditions, all of which have contributed in different ways to where we are today. However, importantly, I'm referring to some of the currents and ideas that are now present in higher education. This thing that I mentioned does not mean rejecting or minimizing, as it's been practiced or in some circles discussed, minimizing Western contributions, the contributions of the Western culture to higher education, to university buildings. On the contrary, we should fully acknowledge the immense role that Western civilization has played in modern scientific progress, the formation of the modern university, the development of critical thinking, and the broader intellectual enlightenment that transformed the world. These achievements are part of humanity's collective treasure and deserve, serious respect. At the same time, a civilizational approach asks us to place these achievements in a wider context, along with rich philosophical, scientific, artistic, and spiritual insight that have emerged from many other cultures and traditions across history. So in this spirit, education would aim to cultivate authentic intellectual respect and meaningful dialogue rather than superficial form of diversity that remain shallow or symbolic. The students would be encouraged to truly listen to perspectives that are different from their own, to understand why people see the world in different ways, and to recognize that no single culture or tradition holds a monopoly on wisdom. They would learn that knowledge grows through exchange, humility, mutual learning, and not necessarily through dominance or dismissal of others. So in this way, a university becomes more than a place for professional training or having a degree. It becomes a space where humanity's diverse voices meet, converse, and learn from one another in a shared search for truth and the common good. Such an institution would not erase differences, obviously, but would help students see different perspectives as sources of insight, creativity, and collective advancement rather than division. I would like to say a few words about economics of higher education. From a Bahá'í perspective, again, that's my understanding, my own interpretation. I am no authority on this. Universities need financial stability, obviously, but they must avoid becoming corporate business driven mainly by profit. The finance or the financial side of the university must ideally balance public support, responsible private contributions, and institutional independence. the guiding questions would not be how to maximize revenue, but how to sustain quality education while preserving academic integrity and social purpose. That brings us to the question of pedagogy and learning. We have to mention that briefly. These are different aspects of university life. A Baha'i-inspired approach to education, I would say, emphasizes learning that is lively, participatory, and closely connected to real-life concerns. It would not reject, this is very important, it would not reject traditional learning, like lectures, for instance. That's the way I understand it. Some Baha'is may disagree with this, such as lecture. Or, I don't know, like memorization alone. That's, these are aspects of mainly traditional approaches to education. That mentor-mentee relationship, for instance. Some of the features of these well-established traditions of the university systems, I believe, exist in the Baha'i context. And along with that, as a part of that traditional, the importance of mastering facts, to me is significantly important, because in waves of modern approaches, facts, memorizing, learning about facts, what history says, what caused Second World War, how many people were killed in the Second World War, what was the Holocaust, how the first League of Nations was established, what was the reason for its failure. These are facts. And we have to learn them in the context of time, when these things happened, where they happened. These are all important things. Unfortunately, now students come talk vehemently, very convincingly about world events without knowing the facts about what they are talking about, which part of the world they are referring to. If you ask them some deeper question about, so what are you talking about? What day, what time, what place? They can answer that. So facts and analysis and synthesis work together. If you don't have facts, how can you analyze and synthesize and make conclusions about events? So this, to me, these universities or educational system, it has gone too much into analysis, critical thinking, and less emphasizing the facts. So in my understanding, a Baha'i university should encourage both to understand solid bodies of knowledge and to learn how to analyze, synthesize, and think independently about them. These are two pieces that work together. If you don't know facts, you cannot be a good analyzer or synthesizer. And on the other hand, if you just learn the facts without proper critical thinking and analysis and all that, then it also becomes useless. So in this sense, it would combine the strength of traditional education, if I want to use the traditional or maybe another word for it, with the insight of modern active learning approaches. At the same time, such an approach would be, I think I mentioned that in my previous interviews with my colleague here, and that is importance of interdisciplinary. That's part of learning and pedagogy. Inviting students to see connection across scientific, humanities, ethics, culture, rather than remaining confined within their academic domain. Learning would also be humanitarian in spirit, linking intellectual development with a sense of responsibility towards others. This must be interwoven into the entire curriculum, not just one course or two courses. Part of the spirit dominating the educational process. So through collaborative effort, community project, and serving others, a student would experience how knowledge can address real human needs. Importantly, this vision would respect both cooperative and individual merit. This is one area, again, that I believe modern education in general, and including higher education, has created the division, unnecessary division, that we need to have a cooperative spirit in the classroom between the students and teacher. The whole system must help students who may have different capacities, different potentialities, help them grow and all that, which is fine. But sometimes that has resulted in somehow less significance or less importance on merit and excellence. So it would encourage teamwork and mutual support while also valuing personal efforts, excellence, and accountability. This is essential. If we emphasize one, in other words, just merit without proper foundation of support and encouragement, that would become somehow unfair. On the other hand, if we just emphasize the cooperative code, maybe cooperative is not the right word, but that vision of empathy, basically, without foundation, that may discourage achievement, progress. This is not, some people misunderstand this with the competitive environment that exists in a society. For instance, people compete for more resources, for more money, and then relate that to selfishness. No. An educational institution must acknowledge merit without that competitive spirit that is negative in the society, that reduces human values, that negates oneness of humanity. So ultimately, the aim is to make education both intellectually rigorous and socially meaningful, helping students understand that knowledge is not simply something to accumulate for personal success, but a capacity to be used thoughtfully to service to others and to the well-being of the society. So in that sense, universities would care about the whole person, not just the mind. That is part of that approach that I just discussed, the whole person. In other words, when we emphasize merit and someone advances in a discipline because of intellectual capacity or whatever is the reason in math and science and progresses, and that must be acknowledged and encouraged and all that, because this is the engine of progress and civilization. Okay? But at the same time, when we emphasize the goal is to care for the whole person, then that eliminates the negatives of people becoming egotistic about their achievements. So it's a very critical situation that we need to maintain a balance. So education would aim to develop intellectual strength, emotional maturity, moral integrity, along with that, the spiritual insight, all together, and would be encouraged to grow an independent thinking while also learning how to work cooperatively for the common good, balancing individuality with unity. So referring to this concept of civilization, at the present level, a Baha'i perspective would see university as key actors in shaping the future of civilization. We can talk about this for hours. This is so significant and profound. They would not only transmit knowledge, but also help culture or society cultivate shared values, understanding, and a sense of global responsibility. And ideally, universities would become a space or spaces where people from different backgrounds can engage in meaningful dialogue, heal social divisions, and work toward a more just and unified world. In this sense, the humanity's collective efforts is to build a better future. There are issues pointing to the deep tension at the heart of today's universities. Now, I thought maybe I briefly mention some of these tensions, then that help us also to understand our whole discussion. For instance, on the one hand, universities are meant to be places where people pursue truth with seriousness, with evidence and intellectual disciplines. On the other hand, they are increasingly pulled toward roles as political advocate, emotional caretakers, and economic providers. I mean, maybe some of these are important, part of the process, but the main focus when it goes towards these areas, then university is deviated from its main purpose. When ideology, particularly partisan ideologies, market pressure, or as I mentioned, this mentality that we have to, kind of that everybody needs empathic therapeutic approach rather than emphasizing simultaneously, nobody is against empathy, but simultaneously emphasizing values, principles, right and wrong. So these cultures becomes too dominant in university system, and therefore shared knowledge can become weakened, basically. One major problem is that the standards of evidence, this is so important. We need to discuss this in a separate way because it's so profound and there are so many areas. This major problem is the standard of evidence and careful reasoning are somehow and sometimes eroding. When ideas are treated as beyond questioning, certain ideas are considered as beyond questioning. When vague concepts replace testable claims. So in that sense, scholarship can drift from honest inquiry towards persuasion, belief systems, or some sort of cultural memes that are accepted as truth. At the same time, fear of kind of cancellation can discourage open debate, leading many scholars to self-censor because if you need to advance an idea, you need to approval your department, your chair, your mentor. You have to go through series of processes, and then funding, and then a publication that is ready to publish your paper. All of these, when they are not taken away in a very subtle way, then obviously intellectual life of the university and free exchange of ideas would suffer. So this narrows intellectual life of the university and undermines its credibility. And as I mentioned, another challenge is to tendency to prioritize emotion over intellect. I mean, I fully agree for care for students. I believe that's essential. Shielding them from difficulty can intentionally make them more fragile rather than more resilient. We need resilient students. Similarly, in the name of equity, if we try to lower standards instead of expanding opportunities, that may ultimately harm the very students they aim to help. So genuine justice would mean providing meaningful support and encouragement while maintaining high expectations. These dualities are not duality. I don't have to say duality. These are two aspects of one spectrum that need to be present for best outcome. Maintaining high expectation while providing meaningful support and encouragement together. If the scale is unbalanced, out of balance, then both of these aspects may be harmed. So going through all of these problems is a deep shift. I bring it into this sort of conclusion that a shift towards materialism and market logic that has gradually reshaped higher education. Increasingly, knowledge is just, judged by how much money I can generate how quickly it leads to a job, or how directly it serves industry. Now, I advocate, in fact, maybe that in previous interviews, that I really believe that we need to re-examine the curriculum, the discipline structure of knowledge, particularly in social sciences and humanities. So I don't want to enter into that. In other words, I really believe that education must have a strong role in improving human life. And instead of keep theorizing and starting with discourses that begin with words and end with ends with words, that needs a profound reshaping of the entire curriculum. So I agree with that. But but at the same time, we have to also address this fact that knowledge is judged by how much money it can generate, and that. So as a result, education begins to look like a shared human quest for understanding that is ideal, and not like a financial institution. As some universities behave like businesses, the students are treated as customers, and degrees are marketed like products, companies, factories. And so research tends to follow where the funding is, rather than where curiosity, wisdom, or human need might lead. And fields of study that do not promise clear financial results are often sidelined, not because they lack value, but because their value cannot be easily measured in dollars. In this environment, truth is quietly redefined as whatever works, whatever feels good, whatever sells, or whatever brings prestige, while deeper questions about meaning, beauty, justice, and purpose are pushed to the margin. What happens is that over time, this shift puts the very identity of the university at risk. Historically, universities were not only centers of technical and professional training, they were moral and cultural institutions that helped shape how societies understand themselves. When market logic dominates, universities can become highly efficient and technologically advanced, yet the potential is that they become spiritually weak and ethically evasive, or dodging responsibility and accountability. They may run smoothly on an administrative level, very, soft, very, structured and clean hierarchies and so on, but lack the moral courage to engage with big questions about what kind of world we are building and what kind of people we ought to become. And no need to say that this critique, whatever I said, is not an argument against university relevance. Rather, it is a call to place them within a larger moral and civilizational framework. Universities need to recover a sense of the unity of knowledge, where scientific inquiry is connected to ethical reflection and technical skills is guided by a sense of responsibility. Learning should be oriented not only toward personal success, but toward service to the common good. And truth must be understood in a fuller sense as both empirical and moral, factual and spiritual. And all of this rests on a simple but powerful idea. Knowledge is a universal human inheritance. It belongs to everyone, not just to the wealthy, the privileged, or the highly specialized. It is a shared quest that carried humanity toward across centuries and civilizations. Higher education should be grounded in the conviction that every person has the right and the capacity to learn, to think, and to contribute meaningfully to the world. And when universities truly embrace this principle, combining higher standards with genuine care, evidence, and accessibility, they can move beyond being engine of production and once again become formative forces for humanity's moral, cultural, intellectual evolution. I think this idea that knowledge must be universal and accessible for free, this is something that is happening. That is happening. But still, we have a long way to go. At the end, I just thought, in order to, because the topic was Baha'i-oriented universities, and there are a few questions that came to my mind that I could not ignore discussing it. And I thought just as a sample, as an examples, discuss a few examples, and or to some it could be a challenge for a Baha'i-oriented university. So discuss that from my own perspective. So based on that, I believe that a Baha'i university or Baha'i-inspired university would not shy away from difficult topics or silence uncomfortable questions, because it is Baha'i and therefore it's kind of has its own framework. So some people may understand it as such, shying away from difficult topics, basically, or uncomfortable question, or even shut down the debate. My understanding is that a true, genuine Baha'i university instead would intentionally create a space where people feel free to ask questions, explore ideas, and look at issues from different angles. That ideal university would recognize that real understanding does not come quickly or easily. See, that is really in line with the nature of science, with the nature of discovery and human inquiry. Learning to be patient, in other words, learning to be patient, I believe, is a part of this scientific inquiry. You cannot get results immediately. And look at issues from different angles, not just one. Contextualize questions. So it would recognize that real understanding does not come quickly or easily, as I said, and it often requires time, as I mentioned, being patient, going through experience, really experience the situation, the question, the uncomfortable, challenging issue, and sustained study, not just by reading a book, coming up with a question, and immediately requesting an answer. The university, Baha'i University, should really tell from the beginning that an essential part of inquiry of anything, any idea, is time, patience, experience, and sustained study. And knowledge grows through conversation. Listen carefully. Knowledge grew through conversation. As we expand conversation, not between some professors who are teaching an interdisciplinary course, but consultation with a wider framework in a particular culture, and ultimately through the opportunities that a grand civilization may create for us. So consultation in that sense, reflection, collective inquiry, and not rigid rules or intellectual conformity. So for this reason, such a university would encourage a spirit of consultation and interdisciplinary collaboration rather than rushing to fixed answers or enforcing a single viewpoint. So one central purpose of higher education is to pass on the accumulated wisdom and recognized knowledge of the past to new generations. At the same time, knowledge is not something frozen or finished. It is alive and continually evolving. So research, inquiry is a careful, systematic process and main way that new ideas, insight, and ways of thinking emerge. It is also how teaching itself improves over time. In this sense, education always has two roles: preserving what humanity has already learned and making rooms for what is yet to be discovered. In other words, continuity, this is so essential and less emphasized these days, a balance between continuity and change. As Alfred North Whitehead once said, and I love that quote, creative advance into novelty. So because of this, education plays a vital role in both maintaining the continuity of civilization and enabling its progress and change. It helps society remember their heritage while also learning how to think, feel, act in new ways that respond to challenges of time. When education becomes disconnected from research and inquiry, it risks turning into simple, repetitive, and again using Whitehead, inert ideas rather than fostering living understanding. So a Baha'i-inspired university would therefore strive to create a teaching learning environment that encourages original thinking, creativity, problem solving, and students would be supported in learning how to evaluate research creatively and how to connect ideas into broader, more inclusive frameworks. And as I mentioned, it would not be limited to memorizing information. It would cultivate the ability to think independently and make connections across disciplines. At the same time, this type of institution would take empirical science seriously, as I mentioned in the beginning, while encouraging philosophical, historical, ethical, and conceptual reflections. Now, I don't want to, this by itself is a very, complicated subject. But my point is, as an example, when we discuss, let's say in a university, biology, physics, that are very set empirical knowledge, information. But to what extent students learn or align that with the philosophical, historical, ethical, conceptual reflections that throughout history have evolved along those scientific empirical knowledge. I'm not saying we should bring a philosophical framework from the Middle Ages and say, okay, now you have to follow this to chemists, to modern chemistry. No, I'm saying that when modern chemists learn what was happening in the past, that philosophical, that historical, that ethical tradition would add something to their new research. And finally, a Baha'i approach would neither impose particular metaphysical beliefs on a student. That's my understanding, even if it's a Baha'i university. Listen, this is not about a particularly funded or founded Baha'i institution. I'm talking about a vision for a university that is somehow inspired by Baha'i framework or worldview. In that sense, neither imposes particular metaphysical beliefs on students. I don't think that is in line with Baha'i thinking. At the same time, it doesn't shut down, it doesn't censor, it doesn't belittle the spiritual or philosophical questions. For example, it would neither require students to accept the human beings have a soul, which is kind of metaphysical, spiritual principle, nor would it forbid or consider it unscientific or somehow irrelevant to the discussion of the possibility that human consciousness might have a spiritual source. In other words, it doesn't say, okay, come to the class into Psychology 101 that we start with the human soul. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that psychology moves on, but it doesn't, when it comes to the question of consciousness, the students somehow need to learn that consciousness is the most mysterious question for scientists, for psychologists, for psychiatrists. There are deep debate about the nature of consciousness. And therefore, that should be, in my judgment, incorporated in a traditional psychology course. So the university would cultivate an open, respectful, and non-judgmental intellectual climate grounded in humility about what we know and what we don't know. In such an environment, the students and faculty would seriously explore questions about mind, consciousness, morality, and spirituality, alongside scientific inquiry, without fear of, ridicule or pressure or ideological constraints. So in this way, science and religion, they're talking about the Baha'i-oriented university, would not be treated as enemies or in constant competition, but as different way that as yet it's complementary way of understanding reality. So genuine dialogue between them would be encouraged as a part of this university curriculum, allowing a spiritual investigation and a spiritual reflection to inform and enrich one another. A spiritual reflection with science, with empirical and everyday science, so that they don't they come together, they reach in each other instead of canceling each other out. And one more example before I finish is that, for instance, a Baha'i approach would neither, let's say in a Baha'i institution or a Baha'i-oriented institution, when the world has sufficiently advanced to reach a degree of certainty that the material interpretations of the world have not provided us with sufficient knowledge about the nature of reality, when the generality of human mind and human intellect and scholars reach to that point, I think that's the point that the Baha'i University comes into the picture. So in that sense, again, we do not, I assume that no particular metaphysical beliefs or on students should be imposed or shut down serious spiritual or philosophical questions. That is the other side of it. For example, the university would not require students to believe that human beings have a soul or being theistic or having any religion. But it would also not dismiss or forbid discussion of the idea that human consciousness might have a spiritual source. So both positions could be examined respectfully rather than treated as dogmas or taboos. This has, I really feel that some people may think this is too idealistic and too far from actual practice, particularly because of what religious fanaticism has historically created and how historically suppressed free inquiry. And that is absolutely irrelevant to the spirituality that the Baha'i faith wants to bring into the picture. So therefore, instead, university would cultivate an open, respectful, and non-judgmental intellectual climate grounded in humility about what we know and what we don't know. And as I said, in this way, science and religion would not be treated as enemies, but rather as complementary, contributing to human knowledge. Another example is just came to my mind. I thought maybe I'd mention it here, even though it's very limited. For instance, in the Bahá'í-inspired university, questions such as evolution, theory of evolution, Darwinian theory of evolution, or the existence of God would not be treated as ideologically battle lines, nor as topics that must be settled in advance by institutional authority. Instead, I believe they would be approached as serious, open, and intellectually worthy questions that belong to the heart of the discourse in higher education. So take evolution, for example. Baha'i-oriented university would fully respect evolution as a well-established scientific theory, grounded in extensive empirical evidence. Students would study that very carefully, understand its methods, and learn how scientific explanations develop observation, testing, and revising over time. At the same time, evolution would not be presented as a complete philosophical worldview. I've used these terminologies very carefully. About the meaning of life or human purpose, rather than treating evolution as either a threat to fate or replacement for it. The university would invite students to think more deeply about how scientific explanations of biological development can coexist with the spiritual and intellectual and philosophical reflections on why life exists and what it is for. In this way, evolution becomes not a source of conflict, but as a starting point for richer, more integrated thinking. Sorry, it becomes too long, but just another example is the question of the existence of God, for instance. Even though it's a Baha'i university, I don't think it should be imposed as a requirement nor dismissed as irrelevant. A Baha'i-oriented university would allow students to explore this question very seriously from multiple angles: philosophical, scientific, historical, ethical, spiritual. And some students might approach it through even cosmology and the origin of the universe. Others through moral experience, beauty, or the nature of consciousness. Still others through religious traditions and texts. The key point is that belief or disbelief would not be part of this obligatory kind of obligation for this curriculum. It would not be policed. Instead, the university would encourage thoughtful reflection, respectful dialogue, and intellectual humility. Students would be invited to deal with these questions rather than receiving a ready-made answer. So this makes this distinctively Baha'i approach, in a sense, that the university avoids these questions. No, but that it frames them in a spirit of integration rather than opposition. Science is taken as seriously on its own terms, and religion is taken seriously on its own terms. The aim is not to prove one at the expense of the other, but to develop students or help students see how different ways of knowing can illuminate different dimensions of reality. In practice, this means that a Baha'i-oriented university would cultivate classrooms when would discuss evolution, consciousness, ethics, purpose, God, in the same intellectual space without fear, ridicule, or dogmatism. The goal would be to form a student, to form curriculum or develop or cultivate students who are scientifically literate and reflective in philosophical terms, spiritually open, instead of pushing them into rigid camps of either scientism or religious literalism. In conclusion, I believe when faced with questions like evolution or the existence of God, Baha'i-oriented university would not seek to end the conversation, but to deepen it. It would treat these issues not as a problem to be silenced or settled, but as opportunities for genuine learning about nature, about humanity, and the deeper meaning of life and reality itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution. As I've listened, I've developed a few questions, which I think are easy. I mean, not theoretical to a large degree. And maybe we can run through them. And I might add some comments after you answer them. So the first one is why does the Baha'i community need universities? So, I, you can have a line of thinking that says there are good universities in every country. We send our kids to those universities. Everything is fine. We have no need for much more. Um, Another perspective might say, we have a lot of time. Maybe we'll focus on that after the next 100 years or so, because first we have to focus on other things. Even education. Let's say we want to start from kindergarten. Let's develop kindergarten and primary schools, and eventually we will look at universities. So the first question is, it's why are universities Baha'i inspired universities? Why would that be? Why would those be important for the Baha'i community now?
Excellent question. And briefly, I provide an answer, and that is, Baha'i faith is a religion with the idea that it is intended to establish the foundation for a global civilization. So it's a big claim. It's a major claim of the Baha'i faith. And naturally, institutions of higher learning, universities and colleges, have always been a part of this civilizational process. Every civilization of the past, to some extent, has established universities and institutions of higher learning. It is almost inevitable. It is it is a part of this civilization building process. In other words, um, increasing knowledge and then systematizing them and then putting them um into a framework so that the society could acknowledge that, realize that, and the outcome would be what they learn come back and enhance the well-being of the society. So for that reason, is important for Baha'is to have a university. Now, when you are absolutely right. Maybe it's not the time. Maybe in the future. Maybe some time ago. But creation of a Baha'i university or Baha'i-oriented university is inevitable. Like the situation of Baha'is in Iran, when they were not allowed to continue their college, their university, because of their religious belief, and they were dismissed from colleges and universities, so they established their own university. It was really the first category that I mentioned in my discussion. It was an attempt to compensate for what was uh, happening in that country and the cruelty that was the cruel way that Baha'i young people were not able to continue their education. So it was a response, it was a need, it was a necessity. But at the same time, that college reflected that university in its long tradition, more than 30 years of tradition, has established, has demonstrated elements of what I just discussed as an open, accessible university. It never turned into a seminary. It never turned into a حوزه علمیه, which is a Islamic equivalency of seminary. It was, since the beginning, the main force, the main item was that this university is a scientific university. It teaches chemistry, physics, pharmacology, and all those disciplines. And yet, you can see a trace of Baha'i moral and spiritual principles running through its curriculum and its structure. So it is that. And then, of course, uh, university systems, as I briefly mentioned, some of the critiques are facing big challenges. And therefore, let's say Baha'is perhaps feel responsible, somehow moral, spiritual responsible to find a solution for these challenges in order to save universities. So a combination of these factors, I believe, could be the reason.
Just just to add my comments to this. So I think every community needs a knowledge infrastructure. And I think the the revolution in technology that has occurred has introduced a lot of changes. And one of the changes is that the the digital infrastructure has been superimposed or has become part of the knowledge infrastructure, which has a lot of effects. And one effect is that um, artificial intelligence, for example, produces particular types of knowledge, new forms of knowledge, faster forms of knowledge with huge impact and very difficult to to specialize in. So even universities are maybe not in control of this domain of knowledge, which is so important and so powerful. And what this domain of knowledge does is it affects the power dimension in the world. So that means that if you are a community or a country that does not keep up with the knowledge infrastructure of the modern world, which implies the digital infrastructure underneath it, then you just simply do not know what is going on in the world and what happens to you. And that is not a good position to be in at this point in time.
Yes.
Um, other Another reason is that there are huge global challenges which need analysis, and it's really hard to do that even from within national systems of higher education and research, because you need a global kind of vision. It's infinitely harder if you don't have a knowledge infrastructure uh, that is really competent, because every community has some kind of knowledge infrastructure, but I'm talking about a specialized knowledge infrastructure, which would involve higher education institutions. Um, so responding to global issues in the future, but even to the challenges of the present, becomes very difficult if the infrastructure is not there. The other problem is to really, I would say, develop an understanding of knowledge, of fields of knowledge, and a vision of what Baha'i higher education should be like. You actually need to run an institution of higher education. You need to create one. That forces you to engage with all those dimensions from the inside and facing all the challenges that are currently present in the world, rather than just functioning in a kind of abstract level where you imagine things outside of the context. So that's one series of observations. The second question is also not very, it's easier, I think. Uh, where do you look for Baha'i inspired visions of higher education? I mean,
Mhm.
I mean, okay, you've presented something of this kind here through your interviews, which is why I am inviting you. But outside of that, where do you look for inspiration for Baha'i inspired visions of higher education?
You know, um, at this point, I have to admit, this is like a more or less some sort of intellectual and enterprise, just expressing ideas, hoping for a future. And at the same time, I believe this type of discourse would enhance the existing Baha'i institutions of learning, not necessarily at the university level, at all levels. Not that I said something, extraordinary, but all of these discourses could create some sort of consensus about certain fundamental aspects of education and particularly higher education. And that would, I believe, would enhance the learning process of the Baha'i community, global Baha'i community. I emphasize the learning process, because even though we discuss the aspects of higher education, but it has implication for the learning in general, for the learning process in general, for how to focus on, for instance, Baha'i teachings. And then, if you remember, I mentioned that Baha'i teachings, Baha'i theology, Baha'i scripture, Baha'i history, even institutions or colleges or let's say places, spaces that are provided to focus on that, I think these contributions could help them to expand that. In other words, read the works of Baha'u'llah, Iran, Aqdas, read the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and then establish relationship with that reading with the intellectual, philosophical, scientific, and social and political events of the 19th and 20th century. You know that. So these are exercises that would be useful for now, and perhaps in the future, when the establishment of more institutions of higher learning by Baha'is are considered, then it can also provide some sort of framework or some sort of guidance.
To me, this sounds like saying, or this might be my own thoughts, that the Baha'i inspired vision of higher education and the Baha'i founded higher education institutions, as well as Baha'i scholars and Baha'i scholarship, they can't really develop one without the other. It
Perfect.
has to somehow link up in some way. Um, so that points to the need for thinking about an infrastructure. Um,
Perfect.
okay, simpler question, maybe a bit weird. Uh, from from my very few references to Mashrikul Adkars or houses of adoration, right?
Mhm.
I might have asked you this before, but in my mind, it still is the case that whenever I think of them, I think of universities. I also think of hospitals, kind of, which is part of, usually hospitals are part of modern universities, in at least of the larger ones.
Yeah.
So I kind of, in my utopian mind, I kind of feel like, how come there isn't one university on each continent to start with? Because that's what we had with houses of adoration. We had one on each continent, and yeah, and I feel the West is a little bit behind on this uh, compared with other areas, maybe. Uh, so do you have any thoughts on this? Which it's a speculative question. Um,
Yes, I fully agree with you. We need to really think about and try to. I'm sure there have been attempts, maybe the environment, the financial situation, the human resources, the social conditions, all of these factors may have contributed to not initiating it or not starting it. But the fact that we need to have that, in my judgment, is very essential. I agree with you. With regard to the Baha'i houses of worship, as you know, the whole idea is that these are centers of spirituality in a really integrated perspective. In other words, it's a place of worship for the followers of all religions. It's ecumenical. And, and these centers of worship in the future, according to the Baha'i scripture, a host of institutions of learning, universities, health, hospitals, taking care of the poor. All these institutions must revolve around these centers of worship, these houses of worship. In other words, it's a very beautiful uh, picture that there is a center of spirituality at the core. I mean, the same thing that we believe it's at the core of human soul. We have a soul, and then around that we have this body, this organism, this life that we have in this physical mortal existence, and so on. So, but there is a core. The same way that religions have a core, the same way that civilizations have a spiritual, moral core. So houses of worship are really a spiritual core for all these humanitarian centers that must be established around that. In other words, gets the energy, the spiritual the moral, the humility, from the center, from the Baha'i house of worship, from prayers and prayerful conduct, rectitude of conduct, all of those, and then spread out to this institution in terms of service.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Last question. So this might be just a bit longer than the previous ones. When I was asking my first question about, why are universities important? Why would they be important to the Baha'i community? Uh, a Baha'i inspired university. Um, I I I I am thinking of one example which I think can be applied to many institutions, but University University of Massachusetts, between 1968 and 1975, had the Department of Education, or really the College of Education, as it was named at the time. It was led and it had a lot of Baha'i staff. And there's all sorts of very interesting, quite revolutionary things happening, which merit discussion some other time. Um, I really, and I really think it is a key educational story for the Baha'i community in North America as a whole. It's a huge story for whoever goes into that research. But um, one thing that you see down the line, looking from 68 until present, until this very present day, is that a lot of national figures uh, in the Baha'i administration, not just within the community, but so members of the NSA, counselors, a whole group of people had studied there. They had their formation, the intellectual formation, into one department. This is
Mhm.
just one department. It's not a university. And so when you look at it, you see the positive side of it at that level and the very immediate impact on the leadership of the Baha'i community. Let's say maybe leadership is too much, but you know, human resources that actually occupy those levels to some degree, to quite a considerable degree. And there's more than that because they also know each other. So there is, there's a sort of common worldview maybe between a lot of a lot of people. There's lots of students that were so both staff and students that were Baha'i in quite huge numbers. So that's one example, but it raises one key question for me, which applies to many educational institutions within the Baha'i community, which is the issue of elite social reproduction. And the issue here is if you do make a Baha'i university of any kind or any educational institution of that nature, how how do you control things so that you don't have just the cultural, social, financial elites of your community accessing that? And then because of it, because this is what education institutions do, they open access to positions of responsibility. That's that's kind of what happens. And so, to I don't want to make a big thing out of it. It's just this is a problem in any kind of educational institution. It doesn't have to have anything to do with Baha'i institution. And the issue is, how is that not primarily ending up functioning as a mechanism for the social reproduction of elites, which means rich families send their kids, the kids go to Oxford and Cambridge, and then they get amazing jobs, and then their kids go, and it kind of just becomes that kind of community where it's the same kind of group of people in charge of many positions in society for generations, and other people have no access. They don't know what's happening there. They're not familiar with those discourses of knowledge. They never get that kind of specialized thinking and so forth. I I think when you set up institutions of this kind, this is something, especially for the Baha'i community, which is very democratic in the way it wants to function, especially in terms of access and participation and so forth. But the tendency, the normal tendency, is for this social reproduction to take place in that way because it's easy. It's how things would normally work. Yeah. So that is both an example and a question. I don't know if you
Yeah,
don't need to say anything about this.
you mentioned excellent points, really thoughtful. Um, can you just, I didn't understand one part. I want to answer it properly and correctly. The part that you mentioned elite, uh, uh, production, that reference to elite. Can you clarify that point?
Yeah. So elite social reproduction.
Mhm.
It just normally, I mean, it's a sociological concept. There is this claim in education, for example, and you'll find it a lot. This is basically what my first master, when I was doing my master's, my supervisor basically told us in a class. It was in one of the first few lectures. Everyone there was a student in education, and the lecture started with him saying, I know each one of you has come here because you think education can change the world, and you've come here to change the world for education. And he said, the reality though at the moment, at least, is that all the research indicates that is the socioeconomic status of students that predicts success in university, and that really what is happening in education institution is the social reproduction of the structures of society, not just elites. So kind of the structure of society just reproduces itself the same way it has been. Uh, and okay, I mean, some might want to take an issue with that, but when you have an education institution, there are fees involved, right? You don't even need to think of university. You can take like any Baha'i conference. There are fees.
Yeah.
600 pounds, $600.
Mhm.
Who can afford, to go? Now, if it's a university 4 year study, the fees are going to be much higher. So the people that would be interested to send people, their kids to a Baha'i university will be Baha'is that are quite educated, understand the worth of a university, want a Baha'i education more than any other kind of education in a sense, and have the means to do that, right?
Mhm.
So it's very easy to open an institution and to find out, for example, that everybody there is maybe the son or daughter of somebody who has quite a position of responsibility in the Baha'i community.
Mhm.
While people that, live in, I don't know, everyday communities, not in major big cities, they don't even know, they will never see that life, that university, Baha'i university life, and so forth, right? Well, oh, maybe there are exceptions, but overall, you can see that. And I can think of some specific institutions where the tendencies for this naturally to happen, and they've become aware of it, and they're working quite hard in in opening the processes up more, right? But I think when you design a university from the beginning, that has to be a consideration, because it's very difficult. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to to
Yes.
to address. Okay.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, first of all, let me say a few words about the University of Massachusetts that you mentioned, that there was a really a center of very active place for Baha'i educators and scholars to come together and actively developed ideas and concepts and theories and models, which was really one of the, in my judgment, one of the highlights of the American Baha'i community. When individuals such as Dr. Jordan and his co-workers, for instance, established and theorized ANISA model, which has a very, very strong conceptual framework, very strong. And then, of course, they went into developing some technical, some specific, particular aspects of the educational system. But the conceptual framework was very strong and it still remains strong. And why it wasn't continued, why we didn't pursue further, I don't know. I don't know. It's maybe it's just matter of time, maybe neglect, maybe something. I don't know. But I wish we could continue that process, advance it, and but I don't know. Maybe when the central figures of that project were gone, there was no enthusiasm or even intellectual capacity to continue that. And so there were so the issues, but I hope in the future we will continue that process. We will build on that and develop that. So that
I,
I feel,
I should
uh,
just say that there are a lot of PhD dissertations of quite well-known Baha'is, and they're
yes,
in the library, like many.
many,
For anybody
yes,
curious, it's quite something. Thank you.
it immensely impacted uh, a, a number of Baha'i educators and made them really enlightened in so many ways about education and the Baha'i faith. So that is, I mean, discussion of Anisa model by itself requires a new meeting, for instance, because it's very comprehensive. It's the way that they develop the philosophical foundation for that, its relationship with the Baha'i principles or Baha'i worldview. These are all interesting things, and the way that those who were trained in that tradition became really active, very powerful forces in advancing the American Baha'i community and advancing the Baha'i discourse on education and social change. So that is one thing that came to my mind. In terms of elite and the mention that you made, it's a reality. It's unfortunate reality that we are living in this world that there are so many things that are not working properly, and of course, the Baha'i community is a part of this system in so many ways. We don't have the number, the human resources, the financial resources, because this is really an infant faith. It's just emerging, and therefore, obviously, that these financial, situational, political, economic, cultural factors somehow may prevent us from advancing our project. But I think I'm sure in the future, these when the things become smoother and the strength of the Baha'i community in terms of number, in terms of resources, in terms of intellectual capacity increase, these activities will be renewed, or new activities will be initiated in order to answer this question of elite that you mentioned. And because really, one thing that I mentioned in this presentation was ultimately, I think education and dissemination of knowledge must be universal and must be free. And so we are hoping for that. We are working towards that. And I hope the social, political, and economic conditions of the world and moral conditions of the world will come together, and we collectively as a human race will realize that. I mean, there are some things that are happening. Now I hear that, for instance, women in Afghanistan who are, because of the political oppression, cannot study. They use this social media, Telegram, and all that, just as an attempt to get some learning. In Africa, the cell phone is sometimes used as an educational tool. So things are happening. I mean, some universities posted their courses with the instruction and professor lectures online for free. And there are in countries, there are legislation that would require the outcome of research or the research results be freely um, in the hands and in control of all people. Not, you don't have to pay for it to read this and that. So there are efforts, there are movements towards that, but I'm sure this is just a basic beginning, and we need to move forward and advance this process to a more complete universalization of knowledge and acquisition of knowledge. So that is one thing. And then you mentioned about School of Education, that the idea was expressed that we are here to change the world, which is really important, because theoretically and from a Baha'i perspective, change of any social change, political change, has roots in education. People must be re-educated. And that re-education involves not just learning and book reading and reading about literature. Those are part of it. But education means basically involves a spiritual reawakening, moral rectitude, education that results in this, and then intellectual capacity. And as we discuss in this discussion, integration of all these in the whole human person. This fundamental change must happen. That I have to admit, unfortunately, many schools of education don't consider that changing of the world in this context. Sometimes they are very politicized, and sometimes they are more concerned about political ideology of the time.
Okay. I think we can end here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, well, we'll see what the future brings. But thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.